we continue now. This third issue we have to discuss is the church. I told you in Canada, praying to the Lord and asking all kinds of questions, the Lord pointed to me to a passage, to a narrative in Matthew chapter 16, verse 18, and you know all that passage. Jesus says to Peter, "You are the stone, and I will build my church, and the forces of the fortresses of hell are not going to prevail, or not to win the fight." This is the passage. I knew the passage. I knew, if I did an exegetical study on this, I was spending years in a Bible college in Germany, and that passage was on the wall of that the meeting place. So I knew it, and the Lord told me, "You read it." So I read it. I said, "Well, I know, Lord." He says, "You know nothing. You read it again and again and again and again." It took me months to get open eyes. And the first thing I saw the passage was the sentence, "I will build my church." This sentence hit me with a might, because to this point I was building Baptist churches, free churches. I was building a church according to my cultural standards, to the denomination I was ordained by. I was building churches, I knew how they function. I never asked myself the question, what's his church? What does this mean? Jesus says, "I built my church." And then, of course, the whole world opened to me, and I saw passages like, for instance, in Psalm 137, verse 1, it says, "If the master builder is not building, then the builders work in vain." So if we do not build what he wants to be built, then we build for the dogs and the cats and the museums of denominational format. That question has never left me since. What is the church Jesus wants to see? He is only building his church, never our churches. So what is his church? And the second discovery in this passage was the sentence, "I built my church," and the word church there is the Greek word ecclesia. Ecclesia, of course, I knew where ecclesia comes from. It is ek, and it is kaleo, and it means more or less to be called out. So in my pietistic tradition, that word meant you are called out of the world to build a holy community of people holified and sanctified, waiting till the transportation towards heaven takes place. So you evangelize people, you bring them into a safe haven, and the goal is to go to the heavenly Jerusalem. Ecclesia meant to be called out of the world, to have nothing to do with the world anymore. And to be honest, when I became a Christian, I was a youth party leader, Communist Party. I didn't grow up in a Christian family. My parents were not Christians. I received an elitarian education in physics and mathematics in one of the leading universities of my country. So I knew nothing about God. And so I was very good connected. I was a secretary of a party. I was a connector in my party organization. So when I became a Christian, my church did everything to close all my contacts to the world. A year later, they were very successful. So I had broken all my connections to the world. I became a real Baptist. A real Baptist meaning get out of the world and please hate the world and have nothing to do with the world any longer. That was my perception. And so when I read this passage and I discovered kaleo again, I first of all discovered that this term, ecclesia was probably taken out of the Septuaginta, the translation of the Old Testament into the Greek language, which took a couple of years before Jesus came. So that term was known. And here in Septuaginta, this term translates Kahal Yahweh. Kahal Yahweh stands for a socio-political community of Israel. Wherever Israel as a nation is gathered, for instance, to build an army to fight the Philistines, or wherever the tribes came together to solve their national problems, Kahal is used. Kahal is also used in the Old Testament wherever social issues are solved in a tribe. Kahal means a gathering of the pieces with a voice to decide, people with a voice to decide to come together and decide society-relevant issues. Up to today, you find the term in Israel. I've been been a board member of a Messianic Jewish association, so I went to Israel many, many times with millions of euros. So I was the Santa Claus coming from Germany to Israel to support all kinds of moshav and kibbutz and what have you. And of course, they liked me to come. And so whenever I came with money and they bought a tractor, a new tractor, and I would ask them, now, you met as a moshav community, as a kibbutz community, you decided for a tractor. How you call that meeting? And they would say, Kahal. Kahal is the meeting where you decide for life. And all life and society relevant issues have been decided in Kahal. So LXX, the Septuaginta, translates Kahal as ecclesia. And ecclesia, the Greek term ecclesia, was used in the Greek language to describe the gathering or the assembly of all citizens of a given Greek city with a right of voice. For instance, Apostle Paul, he was the citizen of Rome. He belonged to the ecclesia of Rome. He was allowed to join into a gathering of all Roman citizens to decide relevant issues, for instance, to elect a synod. If you go, for instance, today to the leftovers of Ephesus in Turkey, you better do. You'll be surprised. It's the best preserved ancient, antique Greek city. So you go there, and 50 meters after the entrance, your guide is going to tell you, see there, you see this amphitheater? So it's an amphitheater. This is the place where the citizens of Ephesus met. And then you ask the person, how did they call that meeting? And the person is going to tell you, ecclesia. And the ecclesia of Ephesus decided many issues. For instance, they decided that in all public toilets of Ephesus, music was played. They played music while you did your business there. So ecclesia decided that issue. Ecclesia also decided whether the Ephesians created an army and were fighting Troas. Ecclesia decided all society-relevant issues. So ecclesia means people are called out of their all-day life to pick up responsibility for the very life in your city. And now the term is used in the New Testament by Jesus, and the term is also used in the New Testament by Paul. And I did a long-range study of this terminology in the New Testament, and I can say today, ecclesia is a central term. It's a master image of the church in the New Testament, and it carries the same notion as the kahal in the Old and ecclesia in the Greek world. So people are called out of the world to accept responsibility for the world. So ecclesia is a complete different terminology. So in my pietistic past, it was being called out of the world to nothing having to do anymore with the world. So I was cut off the world. Ecclesia meant go out of the world. Now, in biblical terms, ecclesia means the exact opposite. So you are called out of the world You are not of the world any longer. You are not of the world, but you are in the world. To do what? To be light of the world. Matthew chapter 5, 14. To be salt of the earth. Matthew chapter 5, verse 13. To go to the world and disciple the nation. To disciple the ethnos. We'll talk about this in a second. So ecclesia, in terms of the biblical understanding, is a church sent to the world to accept responsibility for the world. We are the ambassadors in Jesus' name, going to the world and telling the world that God reconciled himself in Jesus Christ with the world. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18 to 20. And even if this would not be enough, verse 21 in chapter 5 and 2 Corinthians says, in order to become the righteousness of God in the middle of the people. We are the righteousness of God which counts in God's eyes. People may see us and we become the light. We become the children of light. We are children of the day. We are those changing the world. You want to have an orientation for a just world, you look at the church. You want to know where God's light is, you look at the church. You want to know what love means, you look at the church. You look at the church to have an orientation towards God, godly ideas. The church is a sign of the kingdom. The kingdom of God is presented in the middle of the church. The church is here not to enjoy herself. All other master images, there are lots of them in the New Testament. Orlando Costas, the famous, very sad for his death in the 80s, he died. Orlando Costas was a great theologian. So Orlando Costas uses 4 of those images, calling them master images of the church. And all 4, by the way, all images are always serving an idea of being there for others. For instance, the church is a building. It's a household. It's a building of God. It's a temple of the Holy Spirit. A temple is there for the temple, right? The temple enjoys the fact that the temple is there for the temple. No. This building is not here to enjoy herself. This building is here for people. The temple is there for the people come and serve God. And the people is the world. So the church is for the world. The church it consists and gathers people out of the world, but for the world. So ecclesia turns the whole issue of responsibility on the head. It's an upside-down kingdom. All of a sudden you see that the story is different, at least from my evangelical experience, and from the experience of most evangelicals in Germany. I would say 99% of our evangelical churches in Germany are ingrown churches. They're inside focused. They're internally focused. They focused on themselves. You see how much money they spend for themselves. It's the children, it's the youth, it's the women, it's the men, it's everything, it's us. Yeah? We don't have all the data, but Americans, they count everything. They say the average American church will spend less than 1% of their annual budget for mission, for external focus. 99% goes into the church. It's us. We eat up ourselves. We work for ourselves. We build up what's there without any responsibility. Now, you see, we will celebrate Martin Luther's day in just a couple of months. And all Germany is preparing for the Reformation dates. There's a huge conference in 2017. We'll have many, many conferences coming up. And I'm in one of the committees to preparing those conferences. And Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9 is in every mouth. You know what it says? Ephesians chapter 2, verse 8 and 9. You're good Reformed theologians, you should know. What does it say? We are saved because of grace not our works. Yeah. So, and this is Martin Luther's central piece. But what Martin Luther didn't do, he never quoted verse 10. And verse 10 makes the whole thing all of a sudden very practical. Because verse 10 says, we are his workmanship. You know, to do the works he is predesigned for us to do. So we are in the world to do God's work, to do God's task, to do God's mission. The church is there because God has a job for us to do. Otherwise, he would take us home. Yeah? Very often I use a very rude language. Russian, you know, I grew up in the Soviet system, so I'm the only one allowed to use rude language. So I say, well, wouldn't it be easy? I do an evangelism. People give their life to Jesus. For instance, you convert, you come up, you say, thank you, Lord, for your forgiveness. So you're all happy. The Spirit of God falls on you. You are baptized with the Spirit. You're getting real Pentecostal. You speak in tongues. And then God sends an angel and kills you right there. And the next moment, you're in heaven. And you celebrate God's glory in heaven. That would be great, right? No suffering, no problems on the earth, no questions of morals, no discussion, no debate. It's the immediate entrance to heaven. That would be great. But it doesn't happen. Because the day you become born again, you become a missionary. There is now a work to do. You become a part of a church, and this part of your church is not to enjoy yourself. In my eyes, most of the European Christians believe that their most important task on earth is come on Sunday morning to a service, and for 1 hour you warm up the pew. You pass on the energy of your body into that pew, into that sit. And so if you've done this successfully for 30, 40 years, God be very thankful for you. Every Sunday, the same exercise. In our country, we have done a number of research, for instance, on how much sermon do people still remember after the service. So they have been in a service for 1 hour. Right after the service, I will ask them, what did the pastor speak about? You know how many people know? Average? It is 10%. In some churches, 15%, but we haven't found any church, regardless how charismatic they were, with more than that. If a manager in a company comes and says to the chief officer, I will be 15% successful, I would like to see that church, that company, to hire the person. I'll never hire that person. But how comes churches keep their pastors? 15% success. This is bad. It's very bad. Why? Because the issues come in here and they fly out here with an incredible speed of light. I call this the Baptist Autobahn. It could be also be called Reformed Autobahn or Pentecostal Autobahn. I don't care. So it comes in here and it goes out here. And it doesn't even last for the duration of a service, which is just 1 hour long. Then you say, well, but we are worshiping. There's lots of stuff going on. So we did the same thing with worship songs. At the service, we have been singing 5 songs. It's not much, and usually the songs are 1-verse songs. So it's easy to remember, right? Well, you never forget 5 songs. It's simple. So right after the service, I'm asking them, I say, you are OM person, so you tell me, which songs did we sing? And then the guy look at me, and it's less than 10%. They don't remember what they were singing. They don't remember what was preached. They don't remember what they were singing. They don't remember anything going on. But you ask them, have you been blessed? Oh, it was such a blessed service. It was such a blessed service, but somehow the energy, spiritual energy, entered the body and left the body right into the pew. So the pews are very, very, very important. I'm helping an Anglican church to reorient herself at the moment, and the biggest issue is how to get rid of the 200 years old pews. And I understand why they have a problem to get rid of the pews, because they are so blessed. They have been energized for 200 years. You can't get rid of them. We have a huge discussion. We already debate this for 4 months. What do you do with the historic pews? They are very uncomfortable. Young people do not come anymore because they say, how can I sit on those old pews? But the pew is an issue. Pew is an issue. And so we debate and discuss and debate and discuss forever. You know, the Lord would wonder about us. So ecclesia is not the internal focused. Ecclesia is an external focused reality. Ecclesia is there to change the world around us. We are there with a responsibility for the place. The third discovery for me, when I started to discuss ecclesia and look at the ecclesia reality in the New Testament, I found that the term is only used locally. This term is always describing a local reality, in accordance, of course, to the Greek terminology. The Greek understood that ecclesia was a local assembly. It's always the local people, and they're responsible for the locality. They're responsible for the social space locally, for the community locally. As soon as ecclesia is used for a region, it will be used in plural. There is no use of singular ecclesia in the New Testament other than towards a certain community. In other words, ecclesia is a territorial concept. It is a localized concept. So if ecclesia is a community-centered reality, if the responsibility for the world is not just for the world somewhere out there, in its community territorial centered, then my own understanding of church growth and church planting, and I've learned most of my stuff in California at Fuller Theological Seminary, was completely wrong. Then I was a student of Donald McGavran and Peter Wagner. And they were telling us that the best evangelization happens when you look for your kind of people. They call this the homogeneous unit principle. So the thick evangelize the thick. The thin evangelize the thin. The rich evangelize the rich. The Chinese evangelize Chinese. And the Dutch evangelize the Dutch. And the Germans evangelize the Germans. And so on and so on and so on. So you have to design your target group. Find your target group and build your church accordingly. The territorial idea was completely left. It's not the people living in that community. It's not community-centered. It is category-centered. It is the like-minded people-centered. It is the target group-centered. Now, target group-centeredness has nothing to do with the ecclesia of the New Testament. No, I'm not the first blaming of the church growth movement from the US for this. It was Orlando Costas in 1982. He did his doctorate under McGavran. Already then, he was saying McGavran's theory has no theological base. It's not a biblical idea. It's not a biblical idea. But still, it was promoted in the whole world, and we have Saddlebacks and Willow Creeks, and they came to us, and they were telling their success, and we were listening to the success story of their church, and we started to copy. It became a world disease. And at the end, it's captured the imagination of many, many people everywhere in the world. Last year, I was attending a conference in Athens, and the successor of Peter Wagner from the Fuller Theological Seminary, Professor of the Fuller Theological Seminary, was talking about the concept of church growth. You know how he called this? He said this is baloney. Baloney, coming from his own school. Because he says, now look at the United States. Look what happened in the United States. In United States, with all the homogeneous unit principle talking, we have seen an incredible drop in evangelical Christianity. You know, evangelical Christianity in the United States has dropped in absolute numbers 25%. It's not growth, it's getting less. It is George Barna, who is an American specialist on statistics, saying it. He says 15% of the original numbers, but then this was flooded by 10% migrants coming from the migration places. So in absolute numbers, this has dropped from 100 to 75. Is this revival? No. It's decline. It's big decline. But still the church is growing, and we have the examples of the Willow Creeks and the Saddlebacks. And so you have to have a closer look what's growing. Rick Warren with Saddleback, for instance, started to do a very careful analysis. By the way, he completely changed his church. Last year they decided completely to go a different way. Because what happened there, Rick Warren, 20,000 members, and 20,000 sounds great. Oh, like this, 20,000, wow! 20,000, about 6,000 people leaving the church every year, and about 6,000 new ones coming. For instance, Russian Baptists. They flooded the church. Now the church is international. It is even multicultural. But the guys there are Russian Baptists from Moscow and Leningrad. They have been Baptists long before. Rick Warren did not evangelize them. So looking at this concept of transferring the saints, that's what happened here. Because the church concept is creating a great service. You sit for 2 hours, you enjoy an incredible service. There's dancing going on. You know, in some places they even will have donkeys and moose and what have you to come into the service. Crystal Cathedral in California created services. You were there. Hollywood wouldn't dream of this. And now where's Crystal Cathedral? It's broke. Schuller is gone, and after Schuller there is no Schuller. It's gone. It's broke. The whole empire is down, broken to pieces. Why? Because it was human-centered, and it was transfer of the saint systems. So what the homogeneous unit principle, the target group idea, did to us, it fostered church transfers, church hopping we call it. It didn't really foster the growth of the kingdom. Because the idea of ecclesia has left. So if you understand ecclesia, you understand where the church of Christ comes from and what the task is and how local it is, then you start to see what our problem might be. Now in our church, in our places, wherever I go in Germany, I find most of our churches are internally focused. They are target-oriented. They have no relationship to the community around them. Community development is done by social agencies in society. The church is not involved in any community development. The church is actually not doing any real social development. The result is nobody wants that church. They are not relevant. They are not society relevant. Very often I come to a city and I take a taxi and I say, well, would you please bring me to the mediation center of the city, to the reconciliation center of the city. And then the taxi driver, usually a migrant, they don't understand enough German, say, what is mediation? So I explained to him, you have a problem with your neighbor, fighting, the German and you, Do you understand what I'm talking about? Oh, she says Germans are crazy. I eat some smelling stuff. They don't like it. Yeah, I cook my curry. They always blame me. Well, what's the problem with my neighbors? So where do you go to? He says, I don't know. Okay, well, your children and you, the generation of your children and you as parents, you have problems. Where do you go to for mediation? I have no idea. So and then I asked the person just to bring me someplace he thinks might be a mediation center. I've been to psychiatric clinics. I have been brought into hospitals. I have been brought to police. I've been brought to any place except to a church. Only once in my whole life, and I've done this now for many, many years, in many, many places. Only once in my whole life I was brought to a church. It was in Tashkent, in Uzbekistan. The driver was a Muslim. He brought me to a Baptist church. And then I asked him, why did you bring me here? And he says, only here they will ask such dumb questions as you do. Even there, he had no clue that Jesus called his church the ambassadors of reconciliation. Our main responsibility, our core responsibility is to be ambassadors of reconciliation in his name. So, and nobody knows about this? No, it's very simple to check. In my book, Hereinspaziert, Culture of Welcome, Willkommenskultur und Evangelisation, I have what I call a social test, a cultural test for the church. So we usually do welcoming culture. Does the church have a welcoming culture? Do the people living around your church building like you? Do they feel you are a welcoming culture? Don't ask your members because they think they are great. Go and ask the people. And you ask the people around the church building. In Germany, it is usually 90% and more absolute rejection. On Sunday morning, when we are sleeping, they come to their services. And they yell, they're loud, they have all their cars here, they park everything down to nothing. You know, they hate the church. So you are ambassadors of reconciliation. No, you are ambassadors of anger. You create problems. You do not solve problems, you create them. So if that's your church, then how can you be a change factor? How can you be a transformational factor? So when I do this with the churches, for the first time in their church history, the churches may start asking questions. Oh, that's what you think. Yeah. Well, some churches avoid the problem of having angry neighbors, so they move into industrial sectors. In the industrial sector, it's easy to evangelize because you evangelize the machines around you, and they are never angry. The machines are okay. So you move out of the human space, you move out of society, out of community, you build your church someplace. Like one of our churches was so smart, they built their church building within a hotel. It's a big hotel and a big church, growing church, many members. It's one of the great German churches at the A5. And people just go to the Autobahn in an hour or half an hour or 20 minutes, they are sitting in this great temple right at the Autobahn. Ecclesia has changed my perception of what church was. And as soon as I started to understand that, that has brought me into a deep confessional time. I tell you, I've never cried as much as I did in Canada. Because I saw all my church plans. And I saw all my failures. You know, having planted a number of churches, you're a successful guy. In my denomination, I was a successful guy. People would invite me to speak about church planting. I knew everything. Yeah, it's very easy to plant a church when you steal the sheep from others. Well, of course, I never consciously did steal anybody. I just created a creative program. Yeah? We were having ideas, incredible ideas. We were, for instance, the first church with a dancing school. We were the first church with, in Germany, I think in Europe, with a gasoline station belonging to our church. We had creative ideas, and our creative ideas would bring people in, and the people came, and they came in numbers. It didn't take long, and we had 200-300 members. And people were applauding and say, well, Johannes Reimer and his church plantings, he knows how to do it. And God showed me it was your little kingdom, Johannes Reimer. I'm not building your built churches. I want my church. Give me my church back. It was a strong, strong language. So when we will talk church transformation, we have to see this foundations, theological foundations being firm. So we talk about a holistic missiology. We talk about a world orientation, and the world is defined clearly as a place where people live, created by God. People live with a dignity, with a human dignity still in them. And we talk about the church, which is set to be an ecclesia, to accept responsibility for transformation of life, total life, in the places where they live. How do we do this? Now for the, how many minutes do I still have till we close here? So 10 minutes?
5 minutes.
Then break. I will just introduce to you the first words of what we call cycle. So we talk about a cycle at the University of South Africa. University of South Africa, where I'm professor at, is a state university. We have 420,000 students. And out of the 420,000 students, we have just about 15,000 theology students. We are the largest missiological department worldwide. And at this university, we were comparing, and we are able to compare many concepts of church planting worldwide, because most of our students in missiology come from all places in the world. At the moment, we have more than 6,000 Europeans studying with us. And so we compare. And in the 1990s, there was this idea of creating what we call praxis cycle. Praxis cycle understands theology as a Handlungstheorie, as a theory of praxis. So theology comes from the praxis and moves into praxis. Theology is a doing theology rather than a thinking theology. It must be contextual by its very nature. And it is saying goodbye to Western ideas of theology, where you always think theology. You think, you abstract, and your theology is great, but your theology lives on the cloud number 7. But bringing that cloud down to praxis means you have to start with a praxis. So we come from praxis and we go into praxis, contextual theology. And the cycle which I introduced to you has been designed by Madge Karecki. Dr. Madge Karecki, Professor Madge Karecki, is a woman, and she is a great person. She's actually a Franciscan nun. And Madge Karecki created a praxis cycle which involves the following steps. First of all, it involves involvement. She says, if you want to know the content, you have to taste it. Like, this is great water, right? I like that water, by the way. Now, in science, we would say, well, this is water. Distance yourself from the water as much as possible. Be as objective as possible and describe that thing. That's scientific process. So distance yourself from God as much as possible. Distance yourself from the Bible as much as possible. And then read it scientifically. Take it apart. what happens, you never taste it. But you know what happens when I want to know how this tastes? I have to take it to me. I'm not distancing myself. By the way, I'm getting as deep as possible into it. I involve myself into praxis. Now, this idea of getting involved into the context in order to change life comes from liberation theology. And of course, most of us don't like that term. It was developed in Latin America, and it was taken to Africa. And all the umojas of Africa, they work with this idea. In 1976, African theologians in Dar es Salaam decided to build an association of African theology, and each what it is, as it was called, decided we have to see a paradigm change in theology. Instead of thinking theology, we have to go into doing theology. If our theology has no feet to run, and if our theology has no hands to take, and if our theology doesn't lead to life change, what for do we need that theology? One of the most famous African theologians wrote a book entitled Saying Goodbye to the God of the Europeans. Saying goodbye to the God of the Europeans. And in the text it says, and saying hi to the God of heaven. Saying goodbye to the God of thinkers. And saying hi to the God of the obedient and the followers. That was quite something. It changed our perception, and it led to the idea that you have to get involved in order to change the world around you. You have to be in your local setting in order to change that local setting. You can't do it differently. Now, all business, all economy, all sociology, all psychology, all the other disciplines, they know that's true. Except, of course, theology. They knew they didn't want to get involved. So you discuss, you debate, you discourse, you write books, you spend most of your time in the four walls of a library, but then you write books knowing how to change the world. It's actually stupid. Do you know that? Because the distance from one bookshelf to the other is not yet the world around you. And the world is changing rapidly. Get out to the world. At the University of South Africa, the decision was made that no professor of the Faculty of Theology, and it's a state university, may become a theological professor without being a pastor of a church at the same time. You can't do theology without knowing how to apply it. You want to have your theology with feet in hand? Get involved. You want to know how food tastes? Get towards your lunch. And now we're done with with the session. Is this the right time to close?
10 minutes for questions?
Yeah, 10 minutes for questions. Okay. So questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Can you repeat the question for the rest of the group?
When you talk about a very local-oriented church, I mean, it's kind of logical that the church in its early phases was locally oriented because there were no cars and there was no internet. And now we live in a more globalized world, so isn't it naive to think that you could just make it more local?
Yeah. Well, the question is, now we live in a global world, and in times of internet and globalization, isn't at a different time? Shouldn't we go to a globalized ideas? So mobility is much stronger and so on. You know what social sciences do? They start to understand globalization is killing humanity. The internet internet fellowship is no real fellowship. It's actually creating a very lonely person. There is no other addiction which has become so strong, not even drugs, no drugs, as the online. addiction. The online addiction kills a person. So we start to understand we are humans. And Descartes was absolutely stupid for saying, I think, therefore I am. Africans, for instance, they never say this. They say, I belong. That's why I am. I am because I belong. I am a part of a collective. I'm a part of a fellowship. Now, what global Western world does to us, it individualizes processes. It takes my family away. It takes the other away. It makes me the center of the world. And then we start with us being the center of the world, and we end up at the moment with our sexuality being the center of our identity, which is even more stupid. So I am a person because I have something hanging between my legs, or do not. So my sexual orientation becomes the most important identity factor. Where did we end up with? So we reduce. In social sciences, they say today, for instance, in urban developments, they say we have to recreate the village in our cities in order to bring the human dignity and human faces back. People can't live without people around them. As soon as we individualize our existence to a 0 point, we disappear. And that's what's happening. Yeah? There's even a new term, First it was globalization, mobilization, be as flexible as possible. Flexibility was the huge term in our Western world. Today we have a new term. It's called flexicurity. You are flexible, you're mobile, but you also need security. And flexicurity brings you back to the village, brings you back to a community. Community development has become the center term for modern day development in cities, for instance. You can go to Berlin and you see how they developed in newer cities. It's always creating a little enclosed village. By the way, we know today that if your distance from your church to the people you want to reach, not Christians, to the people you want to reach is more than 1.5 kilometers walking distance, you will not reach the person any longer. With all the internet, with all the cars, with all the mobility, it doesn't help. The only person you reach are Christians. They will drive for 20 kilometers, for 40 kilometers. They even drive 100 kilometers, but not non-Christians. If their place is far away, then you are lost. So the mobility in globalized world doesn't change a thing in our approach. We are not farther than the Christians were in the first century, because it's tackling the real issue of belonging, which is much more than just a question of mobility. That's what the churches have become. I'm not dualistic at all. I believe we have to be out there, but the church isn't.
Yeah, but still out in is dualistic.
How the church is in my eyes?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
The church is not of the world, but the church is in the world.
Yeah.
The church is not the world.
Is the world within the church?
Yeah, that's what I'm
Yeah, there is lots of world in the church.
Is that okay or?
Well, I'm quite sure that we will always be a corpus per mixtum. We're a mixed place.
Yeah, that's exactly my question, because when you say we spend, this or that church only spends 1% of their budget on mission,
Yeah.
we spend a huge part of our budget on youth work. In our church, it's our children. It's lots of children in our church, and we spend tons on housing for this work and on all the activities and the communities and all that stuff. That is
And I would say it is mission, but it's not enough. Because you lose your children. You know, the Western Church doing exactly that. We have done this for many, many years. Now, I am in the Western world now. For 76, I was pushed out of my country. So I came to the Western world. In that time, the Baptist Union of Germany, which I belong to, had 104,000 members. Then many, many Baptists came from Eastern Europe. About 350,000. Today, the Baptist Union has less than 74,000. Where are the children? Where are their children? They invested lots of money into their youth work. So what I'm saying is, it's mission, I understand that, but that's not enough, because our responsibility is not just for our children. So if we are concentrating our activity around our families, around our own people, we are ethno-confessional, we are thinking of us as a unit, then we are missing mission. We call this mission, and it is mission to a certain degree, but if this mission does not have anything to do with the world out there, not us, then we will lose our own children. Because that's not our calling. And the Western Church gives you the perfect example of this. You can see it everywhere. You go to the Catholic Church, you go to the Reformed Church, you go to Lutheran Church, you go to Baptist churches. You see it everywhere. Now, with my kids, for instance, we were doing exactly the opposite. I would train my children to be with me among those in need. I would be with them, with those who didn't have anything. And my kids, they're all with the Lord, thank you. But not because I invested so much money into my own kids. I invested with my kids, my energy, into the mission out of the world. And they stayed with the Lord, and they experienced their calling. So I don't believe in any self-centered mission, which at the end kills the very church. And that's the point, you see? If you ask me, is this mission? I say yes, it is mission. But it's not enough. Because that's not the calling of the church. The church has more than that. The church is in the world. And so what you do with staying with your families and with your whatever it is, your community, like we are, one guy told me, we are Dutch Reformed in South Africa, where I'm very often. I say, okay, are you Dutch Reformed? Are you much deformed? What are you? Because if you are Dutch Reformed and you just care for Dutch Reformed, I tell you what happens. The next is going to happen, your Dutch Reformed is going to separate in Christelijke Herreformeerde, and there will be a Christelijke Herreformeerde, Reformeerde, Reformeerde, Herreformeerde, and you will see splits going on everywhere. That's exactly what happens. All of a sudden, being self-centered and not seeing the world out there. And you go, it's all white faces. Dutch Reformed means white. It's all white faces. So how didn't you say that you're only 15%? What about the 85% of your population, which is not white at all? Or we care for our children. Our mission is our children, our families. And that's my problem. Sure, sure. But then it's a different story altogether. If I invest into my church, yeah. Well, here says if you invest in your church in order to be missional in society, isn't that mission then? Then I would say yes. But your actual intention to invest in your church is different. See? And that's the main decision. If I invest into my church because I want to be a better church, I want to save my children, I want to see my people, my kind of people be on the secure side, It's one thing. The other one, I go out into the world. I invest into my church in order that my church becomes a witness for God in the midst of the world. So that's a different story altogether. Then I'm in a missional reality. But the term missional has become, you know, a buzzword. It means everything and nothing. So don't be preoccupied with the term missional, because by now it means everything. So if you are there to be a missional church in the middle of the world, then you be successful. You be successful, but only if you see that the times are kept and food is served properly, and now the time is for eating. Blessing.